Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So we're going to talk a little bit today about something that as Jews, it's hard for us in the modern world to conceptualize this concept, whereas if you came from a Christian background, especially a Catholic background, it's something that it's very easy to understand. And my question for you is, what is an altar? What is an altar? Yes? It's initially a place for sacrifice. As a matter of fact, the Hebrew word for altar is mizbeach. It is from the Hebrew root zevach, which literally means a sacrifice. So a mizbeach is, in Hebrew, the places that sacrifices happen. That's what a mizbeach is, right? That's where the sacrifice happened. Good. Now, since we don't do sacrifices anymore, what's an altar? Yeah.
Another reference that I saw when we do our readings is a place where you worship God.
Yes.
It's like something special has happened, you're in a connection with God, and you build an altar as a memorial or a remembrance.
Excellent, right? Excellent. So an altar becomes it actually starts in our Torah. It's a place where we connect with or worship God. And so when we're talking about the Mizbeach at the end of today's Parsha, which we will, the altar at the end of today's Parsha, it's talking about the one in the tabernacle. That is the altar where sacrifices happened. But we also know, especially from looking back at Genesis, that our ancestors built altars all over the place. They had this special spiritual moment. They would build an altar to God. And so an altar represents a place where the human and the divine can connect in this world, right? And one might argue, well, if God is everywhere, why do we need an altar? We talked about this a little bit last week. If God is everywhere, why do we need an altar? Because it's not for God. God doesn't need this place, but we do, right? We need a place that we can go to, that we can say, this is my place to pray. This is my place to connect. And for many people, as you're here today, a synagogue is one of those places, but we all have our different places that we connect. For some of us, it's in nature. For some of us, it's in Israel, right? There are different times and different places that we can connect. And I want us to think a little bit about the word altar in a broader conception, not just a place of sacrifice, but a place in which we can connect to God. Maybe even, if we want to get a little bit more meta about this, a space or a time in which we can connect to God, right? One of our most famous rabbis of the 20th century, Heschel, right? What did he do? He played with this time-space paradigm. He said, we build castles in space all the time. No pun intended. Now we also have to understand Shabbat as a palace in time. So Heschel understood that time, space, for us, this isn't a physics class, this is a spiritual class, right? Time, space for us are sort of interchangeable in some ways. So I want to think, we get into details here. And it's one of the places, one of the sections of the Torah that we tend to check out. Because we're talking about all of these details. Most of Tetzaveh, most of what we're going to read today is about how the Kohanim are dressed. Every little aspect of it. The Urim and Tumim, the breastplate, the stones that were there, their linens, everything, the way that they looked. And at the end, you can see it talks about the altar. So if you look at chapter 30 of Exodus on page 517, it's the last part of what we're going to read today. You shall make an altar for burning incense. Make it out of acacia wood. So there are actually multiple altars. There was an altar that was for the sacrifice of the animals, and then there was also an altar next to it that was for the incense, right? The smell. And actually, if you want to know about which spices they used, talk to my wife. She did some research on which spices were used back in that time for incense and all of that kind of stuff. So we have to picture this elevated spot with a couple of different altars on top of it. And what I want to do today is understand how sometimes the details can teach us a lot. I'm actually going to go back to a section, not at the end of this, but talks about the altar. I want to go back to Exodus chapter 20, verse 23. So you can find that on page 450. This is right after the Ten Commandments, literally right after the Ten Commandments. The end of it is on page 448, 2 pages beforehand, right? And the first thing after that, we've had this moment of connection with God at the Ten Commandments. And verse 22 says, and if you make for me an altar of stones, do not build it of hewn stones, for by wielding your tool upon them, you have profaned them. So take the stones, they should be naturally sort of cut stones. Don't use iron tools. And then it says, do not ascend my altar by steps, that your nakedness may not be exposed upon it. All right. What? Right? Do not ascend my altar by steps. Now we know that to the top of the altar, if you add everything up in the description, is about 13 feet. So how are we supposed to get up there? And why is this particular verse here? I saw somebody's hand go up. Bernie, do you have a question or you wanted a clarification? Bernie?
On the previous page, he says make an altar.
Yes.
And here he says, and if you make, why is it an if?
Well, v'im mizbeach avanim, if you're making me an altar out of stones, right? So make an altar, and if you're making it out of stones, now most of the altars are going to be, then they have to be naturally shaped stones. You can't, use masonry and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So let's talk about these steps. So what do we think we're trying to learn from this? What's the point? Why would God go out of God's way to say, look, if you're building an altar, don't go up by steps. And then this strange thing, and your nakedness will be exposed upon that. What does this mean? Anybody want to take a crack at this? March. Maybe. Keep going with that. How would you describe that? Well, the challenge is, I like where you're going with it, and we're going to come back to it. The challenge, though, is you still have to get up to the top in order to make the sacrifice. Somebody's got to get up there, right? The Kohanim have to get up to the top of it in order to make the sacrifice, but we can't use steps. So, Marge, is thinking like Rashi. This is what Rashi says, one of our greatest commentators. You shall not ascend with steps, is what he's quoting on. When you build a ramp for the Mizbeach, do not make it of ascending levels. Rather, it should be smooth and inclined. Right? So, think today, instead of steps, think ADA compliant, wheelchair accessibility. Now, I don't think that's why they said that, but that's, in today's world, that's what we're talking about here, right? You go up on a ramp. So, what's the difference? What's the difference between steps and a ramp? And specifically now, we have to bring in this last part, that your nakedness will not be revealed. Yes, Karina? So, yes, there are steps going up to the temple. So this is specifically in the altar. And also, because this is Exodus, this is the tabernacle anyway, the mobile one in the desert. So it's different than the one that's in Jerusalem. The steps going up to the temple was okay. It's the steps going up that last 13 feet to the altar that was a problem. Yeah. No, good question. Well, there are two possibilities, right? There are two possibilities for what this last sentence can mean. One is, it's a statement of reality, of physical reality, right? And Rashi kind of plays with that a little bit in his next comment, right? It's in commenting so that your nakedness will not be uncovered, because steps require you to take wide steps, right? And so perhaps, right, as somebody's going up the steps, he's wearing this gown or this, right? Maybe there's a literal, you're going to, if you're down below, you can look up and you're going to be able to see things that you shouldn't see, right? So that's an option. It's a possibility. But Rashi negates that almost immediately. He says, although it's not an actual exposure of nakedness, for it's written, and make for them linen pants. So we just read, we're going to read in today's chapter, that the Kohanim wore under trousers under that, right? They were wearing pants. So it's not a literal revealing of nakedness. So if it's not literal, it's figurative or spiritual. Now let's try to figure this out. What's the difference between steps and a ramp?
Incline slower, right? An incline, so you make greater progress each step at a time, but an incline's a little bit slower.
Good. I like that, Neil. So an incline tends to be more gradual. With steps, you sort of make greater progress at each steps vertically. Whereas an incline is going to be slower making that, and maybe that's what's being desired here. Slow and steady wins the race, right? Anybody else? Judy.
I'm thinking when you're going up steps, you're being careful, so you're focusing more on the steps. When you're going up a ramp, you can be more attuned to where you're going and what you're going to do when you get there.
So when you're going up steps, you have to be more careful, you're arguing, because you don't want to trip, you don't want to fall, right? They actually did research and they showed that the amount of error in a step, right? Like if you have all the steps that are the same height, it's less than 1/4 of an inch of error will actually cause people to trip. Right? Because your mind sort of calculates and you go up the steps, they're all equal, but if one of them is a little bit different, people are going to trip on that. So you have to pay more attention, potentially on steps, than you do on a ramp. And therefore, what you're arguing, I like it, is that for the steps, you're paying attention to what you're doing and where you're walking. For the ramp, perhaps you're paying attention to where you're going, because you don't have to worry about where you're walking. I like that.
The direction you're looking. So when you go up the steps, you look down.
Right?
Step.
straight ahead. I think that, that combines with what Judy's saying, right? Your focus, the way you're looking is different, whether you're looking down or whether you're looking at your target, so to speak, where you're trying to get to. Karina?
Just thinking on the spiritual level, maybe a ramp is more like a consistent move.
Yeah.
And a step is like a hard stop, and then another hard stop, and then another hard stop. A ramp is just this consistent growth
Yeah.
and angle.
Yeah, I like that. I kind of want to take what Neil was saying, what you were saying. I kind of want to put it together. Let's think about this, right? Steps are this back and forth between hard action and no action, right? So that vertical lifting up is harder than if you were on a ramp. And then you get to this plateau where you're actually stopped. You're not doing anything. It's flat, it's comfortable. As a matter of fact, you can stop on a set of stairs, and many people do, like when they're doing stairs, whatever. You can stop on stairs, and it's totally comfortable. It's like you're standing on the regular ground. It's flat, it's easy. It's harder to stop on an inclined plane, right? You're constantly being pulled backwards if you stop. So on the one hand, it's gradual. On the other hand, it's more consistent, right? The effort, the energy is the same all the way through instead of stops and starts. And there's this need on a ramp to keep moving forward, right? You can't just stop because you're going to be pulled backwards. You feel this force that's pulling you backwards. Where on steps, you're able to stop and you can get distracted. You can do something else. And I think this is a powerful metaphor for how it is that we human beings can approach God and do approach God. How do we do that, right? Do we do it in, most of us, frankly, do it in stops and starts and in these moments of sort of strong effort, and then we kind of forget about it for years sometimes, right? And then we're like, oh, no, something happens to me. I'm going to do it again. And we kind of go up to that next plateau, and then we stop. And what the Torah is telling us here is maybe that's not the best way for us as human beings to try and approach God. Because it's going to, let's go back to, it will reveal our nakedness, right? That phrase is not usually a literal phrase. It actually connects to sin. Connects to us making choices that are not good choices. And so, perhaps, when we don't have that consistent effort, when we don't have that consistent sort of pull, or push in this case, to move up that ramp, when we stop on those steps, it allows us to get distracted, to go off in different directions, which will then pull us maybe in the opposite direction, where we don't want to go, doing things we don't want to do, pull us away from that connection to God. And it's the reason I brought this to you today is, yes, these sections of Torah get very detailed. But sometimes it's in these details that we can learn some of our greatest lessons. Because the details are not arbitrary. The details are not random. There is a reason that we are told not to create steps. Our challenge is to figure out, what does it mean? And there may not be a single answer. That's why I liked all these answers that were given today. And hopefully now, as we read through this and we talk about all of these details, it opens up your mind a little bit, opens up your thought process to being able to say, okay, well, what does this teach me? What does it mean that the altar has to be this way? What does it mean that the olives have to be crushed and prepared in a certain way for the menorah? These are all metaphors. These are all things that are here to teach us something. That's why they're here. So let's open up our minds and our hearts to seeing them perhaps in a different way. Shabbat Shalom.